For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, guys. I'm excited for this. I want to say before I introduce George and Professor Mcqueen, thank you to the audience for your patience. It's a busy day. We got a lot of good shows for you. We did a pre-recording of Steph Harima. He gave a wonderful presentation on the vertical plate tectonics model. So we will be premiering that for you guys either tonight or tomorrow afternoon. Now, today, I'm really excited for this particular stream. We are going to be touching on young Earth creation, discrimination with Professor David Mcqueen. I want to point out, guys, I've got a playlist, okay, on the channel of all of our lectures and discussions with Professor David Mcqueen. He has been a real blessing to this ministry, and I cannot thank him enough. I'm very excited for this one, as I am with all of Professor Mcqueen's presentations. So please check out that playlist with all of his previous lectures and discussions if you have not yet seen them. And all of our lectures and discussions. There we go. I'm going to introduce George. Thanks for being here. I'm going to unmute you guys' mic so you guys can talk. And Professor Mcqueen, once again, thank you so much. You're an incredible blessing.
Well, thank you. You all have been a blessing, and your audience has uplifted me with their interest in these topics.
No problem. David, I'm not going to blame anyone, but it was Standing for Truth's fault, okay?
I'll gladly take the blame. So I want to point out, Doki Doki, thanks so much for the super sticker. I appreciate it. We've got a lot of good people in the audience. And what we're going to be doing, we're going to have some intermissions during the presentation and the talk today for some questions. So guys, make sure you're tagging me with your questions. And as we know, Professor Mcqueen is he's great at answering pretty much anything and everything. So that's why we appreciate you, Professor Mcqueen. So I want to hand it over to you, and you can kick us off.
Okay, I'll do that. Now, today's topic that I've been asked to do by both George and the staff at Standing for Truth is to talk about some of my own personal experiences. It comes to discrimination, job loss, why am I Professor Mcqueen instead of Dr. Mcqueen, things like that. And because this topic of talking about my experience is in some respects uncomfortable for me, I'm going to go for 15 minutes on an introduction, and then we'll take a break and talk about where the flood boundary might be when we talk about Cretaceous, Tertiary, Quaternary, that kind of thing. And then we'll go another 15 minutes with another experience that I've had and another. Now, why do I want to go through this, and why is it important? All of us who went to college in the 60s and the 70s were introduced to evolutionary concepts. In my case, my goal when I was in high school was to get a PhD and become a university professor, teaching Geology 101 and structural geology and things like that. And so I want, in the middle of explaining my situation, to be careful to say that it's not just me, a lot of people. And I want to recommend to you this book by Dr. Jerry Bergman. It's called The Slaughter of the Dissidents. And it is a compilation that Dr. Bergman has done over the last 40 years of people that have been discriminated against, been fired from their jobs. Let me, George, just one part of this that would serve as kind of a introduction to what I'm saying. Have you had Standing for Truth Jerry Bergman on to speak for your group?
No, not yet, Professor McQueen.
Well,
We'd love to, David.
He would be a wonderful person to have on. Let me adjust my camera here a bit. I'm picking up a lot of light over one of my shoulders here. Let me move it more this way. This is from page 79 of his book. It's called Intolerance Against Darwin Skeptics. The debate about creationism and intelligent design often degenerates to attacking the Darwin doubter. Now, this is a vocabulary that Dr. Bergman has developed over the years. People who question in academic settings the Darwinian worldview, he calls Darwin doubters. George, I think that's actually a fairly apt description, isn't it?
Yes, actually, when we spoke to John Mackay a few weeks ago, he actually even mentioned that on his first day or first week at the university, I think he went to Queensland University. That's right. He said his professor actually said, "We will not be studying any such nonsense as catastrophic flood geology." And then he said, "Now meet Charles Lyell." From the word go, John said that was like had the opposite effect on him. It was like painting "Don't touch wet paint."
Yes,
like
exactly.
A little kid.
Exactly.
So,
I've been in the field with John Mackay, and that is his personality. To finish that, it goes this way. Even when Darwin critics are ostensibly concerned primarily or solely with science. And so a great many people that are in academic settings of high schools and universities have the experience that Dr. Bergman himself had 40 years ago as a professor in the United States. And I would recommend a particular book. In 1984, Dr. Bergman wrote a book called The Criterion, Religious Discrimination in America. And that is his own personal account of what happened to him when he was on a tenure track position, and then he was not allowed to be tenured at the university. Now, the second point I want to make, and this applies to everybody, and it certainly applies to me in my experience, is that if you go into the university classroom and if you begin a discussion with a professor or a group of students that deal with creation evolution, and you come across to these people as a Darwin doubter, a critic of Darwin, there is going to be a price to pay. Now, I'm not so much talking to those in your audience that are 60 or 70 years old, but I am talking to what I hope is a great number of young people that are between 15 and 30 years old, and especially those of you that are in college and are thinking about becoming teachers, professors, and also going into professional organizations. In my case, as a geologist, I worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority, an engineering group in Tennessee. I worked for the United States Geological Survey. So in all these groups, they're individuals for whom, as you'll see when I finish my story here in a minute, this issue of the age of the earth and this issue of catastrophic flood geology, it's no minor thing. It's a way that gatekeepers keep you from getting inside the area. I don't know if you like this analogy that many people make in professional settings. Oh, Mr. Smith is a gatekeeper. You can't move up in supervisory rank unless you make Mr. Smith happy. In your experience, have you been around situations like that?
No. In engineering, we don't really get involved in those kind of discussions on young Earth, old Earth. But
Yeah.
we did study geology in our first year. Mainly the basics of the types of rocks, how to identify
Yeah.
them, what their stress levels are, those sorts of things.
Okay.
But I'm sure you're going to cover this, David. But I've heard this numerous times, not just on YouTube but also on Facebook, where they will label us as not real scientists, and I
Yes.
find that unbelievable, considering we've had famous Christian scientists like Newton, Kepler, Maxwell. The list is. I mean, modern science was founded on these people.
Exactly. And it certainly is the case. And perhaps in January or February, we can do a whole session on how the actual vocabulary of geology, Cambrian, goes back to the Reverend Professor Adam Sedgwick, a creationist. The vocabulary for many of the units that are used in the rock record. Devonian doesn't refer really to evolution. It refers to some fish fossils found in the Devonshire area of England. So a lot of these very vocabulary of geology was put together by creationists. So
not just in geology, by the way, David, but a lot of the engineering terms that were used, like Newton per square meter is a Pascal. You know, Maxwell. There's so many units of measure that are named after those famous Christian scientists.
That's correct. So let me begin my first story, and then after 15 minutes, I'm keeping track of the time here. We'll take some questions. Let me tell you my experience leading up to the University of Tennessee, and we're redoing my office, and so my diplomas are not up on the wall like they usually are, but my diplomas are down on the ground. And so here's my University of Tennessee diploma. You'll see I've got a degree in geology, and it's on there someplace. No, it's not. That's my bachelor degree, and I graduated. In Tennessee, we don't know the Latin summa cum laude, so we just put with highest honors. Trying to make you laugh there, George.
We say high distinctions.
Yes, how true. My mom and dad were both born in 1914, and in American history, they are called part of the Depression era. And when my mom and dad would have been at the age to go to high school and college, they chose to drop out and to help the family. So the fact that I was their only son, got to finish at the University of Tennessee was quite a big deal to them. And so the reason that my diploma is so huge from Tennessee is my mom had it blown up, and it was a big deal to her to have it in her house for many years. And so I go off to the University of Tennessee after having attended a Bible college in Kentucky, where I met Mrs. Mcqueen, and we ended up deciding to get married in 1972. After I proposed, as the sun was setting behind some tombstones, there's quite a story there. Ms. Mcqueen reluctantly said yes in that graveyard. And we have been married now, the soon to be 49 years after that. So after our time at the Christian college, we went to the University of Tennessee. Now, it's an important part of my story to tell you that I was no stranger to the faculty of the University of Tennessee when I walked in the door in the fall of 1972. Some of the professors were aware of my work at the International Science Fair level in my high school days. One of the professors actually signed off on a field camp experience that I had taken as a geology student in high school. I actually finished my first college class while I was in high school. And so many of the adults that were around me as I was 17, 18, 19 years old, many of these people figured, oh, Mcqueen is on his way to get a doctorate. He knows how to read and write, and he does well in math. And so I'm sure he'll be very successful. And so when I went to Tennessee and began my program there, I had every intent to go on someplace and get a master's and then a PhD. Because of my success in the science fairs that I've mentioned, I had a part-time job from 1972 to 74, and then a full-time job as a geologist with the United States Geological Survey. Over the years that you have worked, George, have you occasionally been in small offices where there are not hundreds of people, but rather just two or three?
Yes. Some of the teams we worked with were usually around 2 to 3 people. Yes.
So when I came in as a junior geology student with 2 years left at Tennessee, the middle-aged men, the 3 of them that were part of this regional office of the United States Geological Survey, taught me a great deal. One of the men was a specialist in Silurian stratigraphy. One was a structural geologist with an interest in carbonates. And the third one was a economic geologist, copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver. And I accompanied him on a number of field trips looking for copper and zinc in the East Tennessee part. So I got to know these men, but I ruffled their feathers at a certain point when I was hired as a geologist and I was working full time. I helped Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Dwayne Gish set up a creation evolution debate on the campus of the University of Tennessee. And my geology professors, many of whom had been very, very gracious to me and assumed that I was a evolutionary geologist. And I must admit, and in my early days at Tennessee, I was a theistic evolutionist, believing that God had simply used evolution to create what I saw. The more I was around the writings of people like Dr. Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish, the more I realized that this was not true. When I helped with that debate, there was a certain point that I took water out to the 4 people debating, a couple of University of Tennessee professors of biology and then Morris and Gish. And the auditorium was filled not only with my professors, but it turns out my bosses came too, these 3 middle-aged men. And oh, George, I think you can imagine the stir that caused with me being associated with these very well-known creationists.
Oh yeah, you would have been considered someone who's lying for Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it turns out when I went back to work, all 3 of the men that I worked around had, by their families, been given a copy of Dr. Morris's The Genesis Flood. This is the book we've talked about before that's written by Dr. Whitcomb and Dr. Morris in 1961. So I was around these men in the early 70s, but their families had already given them this book because all 3 of the men that I worked around had religious experiences. One of them was a very senior elder, I think, in the Lutheran Church. Now, let me pause there and make a point I'm going to make repeatedly today. I value my time with the United States Geological Survey because on a full and a part-time basis, it lasted for 11 years, all the way up until 1981, from 1970 all the way to 81. And so I'm very thankful for these men. But I made these men that had shown me great kindness really mad because I was reluctant to accept an old Earth and reluctant to accept evolution. They themselves had worked during World War II on strategic minerals in Brazil and throughout America. One of my bosses had been a young Marine on Iwo Jima and lived to tell the story, went to the University of Missouri and got a degree in geology. So these were men that were shocked that I would waste my time at this sort of level. So that's an example of the kind of rub you get in as a professional geologist when it becomes known that you're a Darwin doubter, and when it becomes known that you might be considering that the Earth would be young instead of old. I'd like to pause now and take some questions. Standing for Truth, I know that you have an interest in my viewpoint about where the end of the flood and the beginning of the post-flood world is. Would you like for me to start with that?
Yeah, actually, I think that'd be awesome because I personally, and I think George could agree with this. We've heard a lot of critics point out that, or at least utilize an argument that says, hey, we don't know where the flood layers are, or we don't know where the flood boundary is. So I was kind of curious as to your thoughts on that, Professor Mcqueen.
Go ahead.
David, I would label you as a creationist of questionable intellect.
Oh, thank you. Coming from an Australian that has to prove that your grandfather was in prison to get into the country. I'm just joking.
Yeah, I know. No, we hear these kind of arguments time and time again. You know, like we're not real scientists. We're bigoted and fundamentalists and all that sort of stuff. So
keep in mind that in my day at the Institute for Creation Research, from 1983 to 1987, I was the only one with a master's degree that was allowed to be part of the teaching staff and allowed to be part of ICR. Everybody else had either an educational doctorate or a PhD. So that argument is simply not true. But let's go to the flood. And I anticipated needing my Play-Doh today. So here's a couple of layers of Play-Doh. Let's say that Play-Doh represents all the rocks produced in the time of the Great Flood. And so this is essentially 6 months of flood deposition, and then 6 months of the waters assuaging or going off from the earth. The mountains were being built and so forth. And then at the end of that 12-month period, the ark had landed in Ararat, in the mountains of Ararat. So that's what we would call post-flood period. If you go to the paper I wrote in 1986 for the International Conference on Creationism, you'll see that I divide the flood into 3 parts, 3 phases, I call them. And then there is a post-flood residual catastrophic period during which the ice age, what I call ice moment, occurred. And then there is a time of geologic activity between the birth of Abraham and modern times, post-flood, post-Abrahamic. And then there's modern geologic activity like lava flows in the Hawaiian Islands that date, they were actually seen in the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s. So that's recent geologic activity. But what about this boundary? Here is the post-flood rock, and here is the flood rock. How can you tell the difference between these two? Well, if we go to the southern United States and you look at the rocks that we have from Tennessee all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, in a certain part of Georgia and Alabama, certainly coming down through Tennessee, you have the folded and the faulted Appalachian Mountains. And those Appalachian Mountains go down, and there's an overlap of post-flood sediment on top of it. Using the geologic vocabulary, evolutionary vocabulary, this is the Cenozoic on top of the Mesozoic. This is the Tertiary and Quaternary on top of the two Johnny Clock the Queen. Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, two Johnny Clock the Queen. That's that poem I've taught you in the past. Okay, so here you've got the Southern Appalachian Mountains folded, and they are able to be folded because they were having the rock mechanic characteristics of Play-Doh after at the end of the flood. So they're folded up, and then you've got these other rocks on top of it. And so the rocks that I'm talking about are called the Mississippi Embayment. And they go from North Texas, sweeping through northern Louisiana, up to Memphis and beyond, and then over across much of Mississippi, southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and most of Florida. And so here you can tell the boundary because you go from sandstones, siltstones, and shales that are truly rock. They have now, in the time after the flood, hardened. And then the other rocks on top of them are unconsolidated sands, silts, and clays. So that's one example, standing for truth, of how you can tell the difference between the pre-flood rocks and the post-flood rocks.
Well, that's a really good answer, Professor Mcqueen. That was really helpful. You mentioned the post-flood residual catastrophic period,
Yes.
where we would also have an ice age. I'm kind of
Exactly.
curious, since you touched on that, how best can the flood itself then explain the resulting ice age, Professor Mcqueen?
My colleagues, Dr. Larry Vardaman, who's retired now and living in northern Idaho, probably buried in snow right about now, I would guess. Professor Vardaman had an academic background in atmospheric physics. And so he began to run models around the mid-90s when personal computers became more and more common. And he ran models on what might cause the snow in the extreme north of Canada, down to the Canada-US border, in Europe, and in South America, Antarctica. For answering this question, I'm going to I don't want to talk about what's called mountain glaciers like are in the Alps right now. That's another matter. Let's talk about continental glaciation, the movement of ice sheets from Norway and Sweden over Denmark and down into Germany and so forth, and the movement of ice sheets from northern Canada down into the northern part of the United States, producing a very cold environment, an environment in which the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth had to do not the silly thing, but the logical thing of, and let me pose it to our class here that's watching. If you were with your family and were living in France, for example, and all of a sudden it started getting colder year by year, you might want to move out of your house near the river and go up to the mountains and move into a cave. And this is exactly what Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis did, Neanderthal man. He wasn't dumb for moving into a cave. He was smart for moving into a cave for reasons that we all know. The temperature of a cave is constant year round. It's cool in the winter and fairly warm it's cool in the summer, fairly warm in the winter. And so Neanderthal man, his family, and the whole group of them could do paintings on the cave walls and burials, all the things associated with civilization as this ice sheet moved down. There has been probably, I don't know, the argument probably goes back to 1600. There are erratic boulders in Europe and in the northern part of America, right along the Canadian border. There are erratic boulders just sitting out in people's corn patches. And in the early days, there was an argument, well, are these erratics from Noah's flood, huge boulders that have been moved continent-wide? The idea nowadays, since associated with what are called lateral and terminal moraines, is that these were big rocks that were picked up in the ice. Then as the ice melted, they were dropped along the Canadian-U.S. border in northern Germany. And so it was I got off the track there about the evidence of it. Vardaman and the others believe that the tremendous amount of heat that was introduced into the atmosphere during the flood, as that heat began to dissipate 100 years, 200 years after the flood, it changed climatic conditions so that you began to get not only just snow and ice, but what in some cases might have been ice tornadoes. You ever heard that idea, George, about a situation where the ice would actually form a kind of an ice tornado and capture the woolly mammoth in it?
No, I haven't. In Australia, we've got nice warm weather and long beaches, so you can keep your ice tornadoes.
That's spoken like a good Australian there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready to move on to my next 15-minute segment about this discrimination issue, if I can.
Of course. I've got a couple more questions that I think what we'll do is we'll let you go on.
Well,
to
let me go ahead and take one of those questions. Go ahead and put it up so I can see it.
So here's a question from In His Image. Asked, does Professor Mcqueen think there is a single post-flood boundary? And if so, where roughly on the column is it? If not, why?
Okay. Let me take a two-pronged approach to that question. Thank you, In His Image. I appreciate that. For much of the Earth's surface, let's say 50% we're talking about today, you can find a group of folded and faulted rocks, sandstones, limestone, shales, and it will have an overlap of these unconsolidated sands, silts, and clays, like is found up the Mississippi River all the way up into Ohio, and it goes quite a bit north. And so that boundary between those rocks is a boundary in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. Now let's work through the column again using the poem I've taught you. Carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, to Johnny Clock the Queen. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, carry out some Devonian dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous to Johnny Clock, Clock with a K, the Queen, Tertiary, Quaternary. In the Southern Appalachians, we have the coal measures around the basin, the Nashville Basin. And so here you've got these enormous coal deposits, and erosion has taken them into kind of a donut shape. We're from space. That's where Nashville, Tennessee is there. And those deposits go up Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, Permian in some cases. So that the boundary in the Southern Appalachians is somewhere between the Paleozoic and the Cenozoic. So that's in East Tennessee. So then you go out west and you look at the you look at the Jurassic and Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rocks west of the Pecos, so to speak, out in Arizona and north of the Grand Canyon. In those places, those rocks, such as what I've studied in Wyoming, the Morrison Formation that contain dinosaur bone fragments, they are part of the Rocky Mountain orogeny, and they have rock layers like this. And I'll use this Post-it note to make it appear that there is some rivers that go down across these dinosaur fossils. And so in this area, in the western United States, the boundary is between what the evolutionary geologists call Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. I think we should take a whole session, Standing for Truth, in January and talk about the idea of the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary of the flood, where there is supposed to be meteorite impacts, a high instance of the element iridium.
Right.
Let's defer that for the future.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. I appreciate you taking so much time to answer these questions, and it shows that you are looked up to highly with how many questions we get from the audience during our time here with you every time you're here. So I appreciate it, Professor.
I began teaching college the month and year that Mount St. Helens erupted. That's May of 1980. So I've been doing this for 40 years, and I enjoy the teaching aspects of it. So let's go on now to the next 15-minute segment.
Yes.
Deals with my experiences at the University of Michigan. I didn't spend the money that my mama did to have my Michigan diploma blown up the size of wallpaper and so forth. But here is my diploma from Michigan showing that I got a master's. Now, why would I have gotten a master's in Michigan in 1979 when I had gone there as a National Science Foundation graduate fellow in 1975 with an intent to get a PhD? Let me give you some background on this National Science Foundation graduate fellowship. My bosses at the U.S. Geological Survey said, go ahead and apply for it. Very few people get it. But one of the benefits that you get is that your tuition is paid at any geology school in America, and you get a stipend. so that you and Ms. Mcqueen can live in a place like Madison, Wisconsin, or the University of Michigan. And so I set off on a quest to go to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and also the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and talk to the professors there about possible PhD work. Now, both those universities, and I'll focus on the University of Michigan, had a very unique policy to me in the 1970s. Even though the NSF Graduate Fellowship was intended for 3 years, plenty enough time to get a doctorate and get out, the rules at the University of Michigan were that you had to spend a couple of years working on your master's thesis, and then you'd be formally admitted to the PhD program. And then I would use the final year of my NSF, the third year, and do the first year of my work for my PhD. And if it took longer, I'd get a teaching assistantship or something like that. Well, because on this particular year, 1975, in the Department of Geology, I was the only one with an NSF graduate fellowship. And when I began to talk at our first meeting, when I was introduced, my Yankee buddies that had grown up and gone to school at Brown and Princeton and SUNY New York and places like that, they made fun of the way I pronounced things like ice water and my Southern accent. But they had to pause because they knew that not just anybody, not even an East Tennessee hillbilly like me, could you get an NSF graduate fellow. So because I had this fellowship, I had the luxury of finishing all my PhD academic work during the first 2 years. And so I had all the coursework I needed to emphasize my research, which was intended to be research on what we call mineral physics, dealing with the kind of structures found in ore deposits that are put under tectonic pressure. Okay, so during this time of academic liberty, I was kind of rejoicing. Why? University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, in the mid-70s, were listed on certain sheets of paper as one of the 10 best geology schools in America. Now, George, let me pose a question to you. If I'm going to this university that's supposed to be one of the best, would you think that they would believe in freedom of speech, research taking you where you want, where it leads you, freedom of expression? What would you think about that, George?
Well, knowing a little bit about the American Constitution, I would think so.
Yeah, you would think so. It turns out that this is something that was absolutely wrong and prevented me actually from getting a PhD. Let me tell you how the story developed. During the first 2 years, because I had this scholarship, I had the freedom to take more classes than my fellow graduate students that were in the master's and PhD program. So I chose to take an undergraduate class in organic evolution because I wanted to actually see what was being taught at the University of Michigan. My professor was very gracious to me because ordinarily graduate students never took his class. I started out just auditing it, but I took all the tests, and in the end, he converted my grade to an A. But I asked him at the beginning of the class, as we were using a book that was very commonly used in the 70s by a professor named Moody, an evolution book named Moody. I said, can I play the devil's advocate with you? Can I, when you get to a certain point about homology, or you get a certain point about the transitional organisms between amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, You mind if I play the devil's advocate and say, well, show me the evidence. Where's the evidence? Oh, he welcomed this. And at one of the parties that we had at the end of the 2 years, he had gotten an enormous piece of what we would call brown paper. The thing must have been 20 feet long. And he wrote me a big long check that I could be a critic in his class anytime I wanted to. And we all had quite a bit of fun about it. But it turns out the people that were on my committee that were the gatekeepers to allow me to enter the PhD program didn't find this humorous at all. They suspected I was a Darwin doubter. And a story I'll tell the audience that I think you'll find interesting is the University of Michigan was an endowed, and still is, an endowed university. And so they had the money to invite some of the most prominent geologists that were publishing in the mid-70s to come and give talks. The paleontologist Bacher that came up with the idea of hot-blooded dinosaurs came and talked. And then they had some specialists on the Ediacara fauna in Australia and other places, and they came and talked. And during one of these lectures, a very prominent geologist, I'm not going to mention his name, brought up the idea of radioactive halos, Bob Gentry's work in radioactive halos. And so I raised my hand at the end. I said, you know, it's interesting, Professor, that you would bring that up, because for 3 years I was Bob Gentry's lab assistant at Oak Ridge National Labs. And what do you think about Gentry's argument that the radius of the polonium halos presents a very good argument that radiometric dating is incorrect, that we don't know how the clock has ticked? Oh, boy. After that lecture was over, a man who became quite a close friend, actually, he was a PhD metamorphic petrologist named Eric Cassine, passed away now, but he was a UC Berkeley grad and a very prominent professor there at Michigan. He took me to one side and he said, Mcqueen, I realize you go to church and you need to think about this like Sunday school. You don't go up to the Sunday school teacher and embarrass him in public. We spent $1,000 to get him here and put him up in the motel and drive him around. You can't embarrass him like that. I'll pause there and get the reaction from you, George, as to the academic freedom I was given that day.
Well, David, I know for a fact, even in Australia, where was it now? Yeah, just give me a second. The Geological Society of Australia openly seeks to censor creationist, intelligent design, and flood geology.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just something that occurs in America. It seems to be all over the world that there's this general view that you can't talk about creation, you can't talk about intelligent design, and flood geology is definitely out of the question. So yeah.
I see Graham Gould's question there about those wanting to study geology regarding this persecution. My advice is this. You can go in to a part of geology, let's say mineralogy, and you can get a PhD studying a type of mica and do the electron microprobe work and find out the relationship to that mica in a certain part of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. You can do that and you can get out with a PhD pretty much without argument, so long as you're able to present when you have to stand before your doctoral dissertation defense and questioning and forth. You have to at the very least, be able to explain at a fairly high level the idea of neo-Darwinism, the idea of punctuated equilibrium, and so forth. But if they suspect that you're a Darwin doubter like me, you may get the letter I got. Well, I went ahead and applied to enter the PhD program. The PhD committee met and rejected my application. And I was so shocked at this because I had this 3-year fellowship and I had a year left that I went to, again, a very kind man. I want you to be clear again that every time I've been on Standing for Truth, I've been able to use something I learned at the University of Michigan during my 2 years there. So I'm deeply grateful for what I was taught. Going to a university at a graduate level is like going to a museum. What they tell you, half of it is true. You have to decide which half, though, is true based on what presuppositions. So I'm very thankful, but here's the way it went. So I went to the department and I said, I have to report back to the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. Write me a letter and explain to me why I was not admitted to the program. There is a front door story and there's a behind the scenes story. The front door story is that the letter read, Mcqueen, you have not demonstrated research competence. All you've done is take classes. Okay, now let's think about that for a minute. I had this fellowship that gave me the freedom to take all the classes that were required for me at the PhD level. So they required a certain number of hours. I don't remember the exact number, but let's say that it was 30. I had that. So I wrote them a letter back and said, well, the reason that I haven't demonstrated research competence is I spent the last 2 years taking classes for my PhD. Go ahead, admit me to the program, and I'll show you what I can do. Well, they decided that I could not be admitted. And I'll go to the end of the story. I was working on the deformation of stibnite, and I continued working on it when I left the university in 1977, all the way up to when I got my degree in 79. And then in 1978, I got a chance to present my research at a international meeting in Canada. And then my master's thesis was published in the European journal Elsevier. Elsevier published it. It was called Tectonophysics. And one of the men that had voted against me for the PhD was one of the co-authors of my paper. So any argument that I had no research competence, do you see, George, how I was vindicated by the publication of this paper?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's numerous examples of similar situations. I can cite Mark Armitage, for example.
Yes.
He's one that comes off the top of my head.
Yeah, me too.
I think Michael Behe. Who else? Even an evolutionist. Even an evolutionist himself. The publisher, the editor. I forget his name. He was an evolutionary biologist. He actually got sacked because he allowed a intelligent design article to be published on the magazine. So it happens everywhere. It doesn't matter who you are.
I hope you and the audience are hearing what the three of us are saying. This is not a sour grapes David Mcqueen story. This is very common and has been common in academia for the last 50 years. And so when you think about this, you have to go back to what I said in the beginning. Everybody who is vocal and public as a Darwin doubter is going to get some flack. Some people can get through their PhD, some people cannot. but there is a price to pay. And so, in answer to the question earlier, what advice would you give? You have to sit back and say, if I'm going to get a degree in astronomy or geology, I may not be able to get a PhD because of the price I'm going to have to pay. But if I want to get a degree in a PhD in mathematics or chemistry, you see, that would be very much more straightforward to get, because you wouldn't have the constant argument, oh, you don't believe that a trilobite
That's a
is
good point.
500 million years old, or you don't believe that the various orogenies on Earth occurred over millions of years. You have this insane idea that all this can be compressed into 6,000 years. I hope you can see my point there. And let's go back to some questions from the audience about, now, again, you can feel free to ask questions about this type of academic discrimination, or we can talk about the zinc deposits of Tennessee or something.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of questions here. Like I said, I mean, people love your presentations and your lectures, Professor Mcqueen. So we could probably ask you questions till tomorrow. But I've got a curious one here, because I've heard this one. It does go back to flood geology here.
Yeah.
Because I've heard a question or an argument. I'm curious if you've heard of this one and what your thoughts are. It's in regards to the Appalachian Mountains that you were talking about earlier. And the question from the critics goes like this. They say, how do we get a stratigraphied folded mountain range that is between two divergent plates, according to our model? Is that a question you're familiar with? Or
yeah. And let me pull up my whiteboard here, which is pieces of white paper, and let me draw this off conceptually. Now, traditional geology views the Appalachian Mountains, which actually are contiguous, or what would the right word be? They continue through America, up through Canada, and across over into Scotland and England. And so the orogeny that caused the Appalachian Mountains is supposed to be one of the oldest ones. And the Appalachians are supposed to be older than the Rocky Mountains. So let's draw here the one world continent, and we'll use this as the North Pole here. We'll draw the one world continent that we as flood geologists consider to be before the time of the flood. Many of you know the vocabulary of the Tethys Sea, Gondwana land, and so forth. I won't take the time to put this on here, but I will put some squigglies to indicate that this is water, this is ocean, and then the continent was there. Okay. The fountains of the Great Deep break up, and we begin to get continental separation and the beginnings of plate tectonics. And so we'll view this as scene one. Now let's go to scene two. And instead of the whole world, let me focus on Europe and North Africa. I'll put North Africa here, Europe here. And then here is the sediments in North America. And once again, the North Arrow. So if we draw it like this, where we've got the North Arrow and Europe and North Africa and then North America, during the first 6 months of the flood, the units that are found in North America in the Appalachian Mountains are laid down. This begins with in Tennessee, the Cambrian Rome shale with trilobites in it, goes up through the carbonates of what's called the Knox group. These are dolomites and limestones, and then proceeds on up through large sandstone bodies and culminates with, for my purposes, the Pennsylvanian and Mississippian coal measures, which in other parts of the world are called the Carboniferous in Europe. Okay, so all these layers get laid down. Okay, this is scene 2, and this scene is occurring maybe, 3 months into the flood. So you got all this being deposited, and then what is now viewed as the, how could I illustrate this? The vocabulary that's being used is convergent versus divergent plate boundaries. So if we take the Plato once again and go down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we find the plate associated with Europe meeting the plate that's associated with North America. And this is the mid-Atlantic ridge that runs up the Atlantic Ocean all the way, and you can actually see it in the country of Iceland. Several creationists have led tours there lately, so you can literally put 1 foot on the blue and 1 foot on the red, and you're on 2 different tectonic plates. And it's true that right now they are divergent. The flood geology argument is that it has not always been the case. That Europe and North America collided late in the flood along this line here, and here in North America, you have the formation of the Appalachian Mountains. And then it goes all the way around to Scotland and over into, let's stop at Scotland for now. You can find units there that are very similar to the units that you have in North America. And everybody, and including these, remember I told you the story earlier about working with these 3 geologists who themselves were in their 40s when I was in my 20s. One of them loved to tell the story of what one of his professors did, where you put together North America and South America and Africa and Europe. And he loved telling the story about his professor having him actually take a map of the world and cut along the continental shelf. And it's obvious that the knee of South America, and again, this is north here, fits in to South America. The fit for North America is not as clear, but everybody has seen how South America fits into that part of Africa. And it turns out the rock units are contiguous across that. So to summarize my argument, early in the flood, maybe the first 6 months, 3 months, maybe, the units that are made up in the Appalachian Mountains were formed, and they were in this rock mechanics argument we've been talking about, essentially the consistency of Plato. So they get folded into the Appalachian Mountains, but it's a regional thing. It's a worldwide thing. There are 100 geologic facts that push me toward flood geology. One of them is the fact that these stratigraphic units like the Coconino we've talked about in the past, other units that are in South America and Africa, they can be traced worldwide. and can be traced in the petroleum geology, the drill cores that Dr. Tim Clary has been working on and published a book about recently. Does that help in the explanation of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was a phenomenal answer, incredibly detailed, and that was extremely helpful. You mentioned, and I find flood geology so interesting and fascinating, especially listening to you talk about it, Professor Mcqueen. You mentioned Europe and North America would have collided late in the flood. So in a sense, during the flood period, would there have been mini supercontinents formed almost temporarily?
Well, I think the clearest way to say it for Standing for Truth was this, that there was, and let me get some Play-Doh here to make it, there was one world continent before the flood. And this is an argument based on the book of Genesis, what happens between day 1, day 2, and day 3.
Right.
You'll recall that the mountains rose up and there was a flood in the book of Genesis chapter 1. That's the flood of Adam's day, if you will, not the flood of Noah in chapter 6, 7, and 8. So there was all kinds, apparently, of tectonic activity that revolved around this C-shaped continent in the time of the flood. Creation and then up to the time of the flood. And so these different units began to break apart during the flood. And we'll let this be Europe and this be America. And they collided perhaps several times. But the most important thing is that the Appalachian orogeny occurred there.
Right.
I've always thought, although I haven't thought through it lately, that the Rocky Mountains probably were formed, and that Rocky Mountain orogeny was later on in the flood. But that's a topic for further research.
Well, that's a great answer. Extremely helpful. Maybe before we move on to the next phase, I should ask this one because we've got Baptist Chad who sent in a $5 super chat to ask his question.
Okay,
so, Chad,
good.
we appreciate the support.
Let me answer Chad's question here. What is the best evidence against uniformitarianism, and how did all animals gather into all the world like the kangaroo? The issue of how the kangaroos got to Australia, for example, I'd like to defer to another time. The quick answer there is that the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth may have taken them there, walked them there. So that's a simple answer. In the post-flood time. But what is the best argument against uniformitarianism? I think that one of the best arguments can be found in what we talked about a couple of weeks ago about the geology of the Grand Canyon. If uniformitarianism were true, you should find two things in the Grand Canyon. You should find exactly what Darwin predicted, but did not find back in 1859. You should find transitional organisms from the trilobites in the bottom all the way up to the footprints of the reptiles and amphibians in the Coconino Sandstone. I've hiked the canyon 5 times. I've spent 5 weeks in it looking for these transitional forms. They're not there because they never were there. The fossils in the Grand Canyon appear abruptly and fully formed. The second thing you can learn from the Grand Canyon is that a unit like the Coconino Sandstone is not just in that part of the Colorado River. It's not just in that part of the state of Arizona, but it can be found across North America. And equivalent units to that sandstone can be found worldwide. That sounds like not a process that's going slow and taking a long time, but rather a process that's occurring, like my colleague Dr. Gary Parker likes to say, not slow long ago, but fast in the recent past. And so the basic argument against against uniformitarianism is found both in the rocks of the world and the nature of the fossil record.
There are so many other things you can insert there, David, but yeah, I guess that's one of the things. You've got the knife sharp boundary between layers. No erosion, evidence of erosion.
Yes.
No evidence of soil deposition between the layers. So yeah, you should expect those things. If uniformitarianism is correct, there should be at least erosion.
You don't find them, George.
No.
You don't find them. Okay, let me go on to my next point. And those of you that are going to be talking, for example, in church settings, this is one of the early editions of Dr. Morris's study Bible, it's now called. He called it a Defender's Study Bible. When you talk about the Bible in relation to getting a university degree, you often get into this sort of thing, and here's a humorous way that I do it. Here is a United States 50-cent piece. This one is called the Kennedy $50. So this is a 50-cent piece. And then one of my mother's friends gave me a silver dollar from 1896 that I've kept in my collection over the years. Here's the silver dollar. What you can do is George, have I commented that I'm trying to become a magician? I may not have mentioned that to you. And so this is the way that I try to trick my granddaughter, who's 2 years old. I'll say, watch Grandpa. He's going to hold this and put it in his hand, and he's going to pass my hands together and then move it back. Look, it's gone. There it is. I'm arguing that the evolutionary community portrays themselves to the American public as magicians, where the coin of the evidence of evolution magically appears, and then when you're not looking, it disappears. The argument that's given often for the truth of, say, evolution is probability. And by using card tricks and so forth, you can illustrate this in public. What's my argument? What's my tip to young preachers out there? You can use a coin trick to comment about its magic. Evolution is not relying on science, but on magic. Okay, can I go on to my final story here? And then we'll take questions at the end. Is that okay? We have enough time?
Yep.
George, do that. Okay, I want to move now from my experience at Tennessee and Michigan to being a professor at Virginia State University in Virginia. I was invited during that time to be part of the Arkansas Creation Evolution trial that was occurring in 81 and 82. I've mentioned this briefly because this is when former President Bill Clinton was the Attorney General of the state of Arkansas. Because I participated as a pretrial witness, I never actually got called to Arkansas to do it, but I was part of a group of 20 that was initially called. The judge in that trial, who turns out, take a wild guess, George, as to what the profession of the judge's mama was. His mama was a angry evolutionary Arkansas high school biology teacher. So he'd been raised with a bias against the Scopes trial and fundamentalism and so forth. And so at a certain point, he said, evolution, you can keep the 20 witnesses you have, but cut the B team out of the creationists. Just let people like Bob Gentry and Dr. Gish do there. So I got cut out. But when word got back to the chairman of the department and the dean, all of a sudden my contract wasn't renewed the next year. And so that's one price to pay. And the details of that and the Arkansas trial, I'd like to table for another time. After being fired at Virginia State University, I moved back to my boyhood home in Tennessee, and I began looking for a job at East Tennessee State University. The only job opening that they had in 1982 and 1983, when our youngest son was born, was an opening in the physics department. So I filled out my application. I had done work at Tennessee in honors physics. I had experience in rock mechanics, geophysics at both Tennessee and Michigan. So I had enough background to be able to teach Physics 101. So I applied for the job and I interviewed with the different professors. Well, one of the professors was a biophysicist that had followed in some detail, it turns out, the Arkansas creation evolution trial. Now, keep in mind the time frame here. That trial was 81, 82, and then I'm applying for this job in 82, 83. So it was current news, so to speak. And so, George, let me tell you the question that this professor posed to me when I walked into his office, and see if you have ever been asked this. Listen carefully, George. George, I'm going to ask you a question, and your answer to it will dictate our friendship for the rest of your life. Respond to that. You ever been asked that question, my friend?
Not from an evolutionary perspective, no, but
Yeah. Well, let me tell you
those kind of friends I don't need, by the way.
Yes, how true. So at any rate, he sat me down, asked me that question, and I said, well, ask your question. He said, how old is the Earth? And I said, based on scientific and historical evidence, the Earth appears to be less than 10,000 years old. He said, get out of my office. I never want to talk to you again. A month later, our youngest son was born, and I was passing out the Christian equivalent of cigars, some bubble gum or something in the hall, to recognize the birth of my son. This fellow walked down the hall, and true to his word, he walked to the other wall and walked down, did not meet my eye, did not take my bubble gum, and he and I remained enemies to the end. In the audience, raise your hand if you think I got that job teaching physics. No, the answer is no. God used that opportunity to take me to ICR the next year. So I hope you can see in these stories I've told the thread of God moving me from Tennessee to Michigan, where I learned critical things and had an opportunity to testify, if you will, and then moved me on to Virginia State and then to East Tennessee State. I can see that from my side of the tapestry of my life, it appears that there are a bunch of these dark threads that run through. But in eternity future, when I see those dark threads, it turns out they're going to be a very great blessing in my life, because I see how those threads brought me to where I am today. So I hope that is an overview of my experience with discrimination at the university level. I am ready to take some more questions, standing for truth, if you have some more about this.
Well, David, I was just going to add it. the discrimination isn't just at the academia level. There are so many examples. For example, at the Nobel Prize section of science, there's
Yes.
who was it? Romanian creationist professor Nicolae Pălascu, for example, first discovered insulin, but the Nobel Prize was offered to Frederick Banting and John McLeod. There's Ramian Damadian, the inventor of the MRI scanning.
Yes.
Scientific American, we all know the publication, refuses to hire any creationist.
Yes.
You
And
can go.
the phrase that's used in America nowadays is, what is the litmus test to be an editor at Scientific American? What's the litmus test? You might remember this from high school chemistry, things turning red, things turning
Blue,
green,
yep. Yes.
blue. And so the litmus test is, if you're a Darwin doubter, go flip burgers at the local restaurant. We don't want you here.
Yep. I mean, I've got so many. Now I remember the guy, Richard Sternberg,
Yes.
Smithsonian research associate and former managing editor of the independent journal called the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. Now, he's
Yeah.
the guy I spoke about, where he allowed an intelligent design article to be published in that journal, and he was actually sacked because of it.
Oh, yes. And, please, those of you that are listening, when you watch this again, go back to my preliminary remarks over an hour ago. I'm not alone in this. My brother George has brought up wonderful examples. And if you want to read page after page, this book here is over 400 pages by Dr. Bergman, Slaughter of the Dissidents. If you want to read more about this level of discrimination at high school and college, I would recommend this book to Jerry Bergman, Slaughter of the Dissidents. And it's published by, I can't find the publisher. It's here. There we go. It's called Leaf Cutter Press. So I would recommend that to the group. Any other questions?
There's also an excellent video, David, called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. They go through numerous cases
yeah, I've seen that video. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Let me go ahead and answer the question by Renwell here. What piece of evidence convinces you most of a young Earth over an old Earth? We can, in the future, go through my top 10, but let me build an argument around one of my favorites, and that is the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. This is one of my favorites because it was popularized in the early 80s by one of the men that hired me at ICR. Dr. Tom Barnes was part of the graduate school in those days. And Tom Barnes was a physicist at the University of Texas, El Paso, as I recall. He compiled the evidence from the 1800s, which showed a very interesting thing. Let me go back to my handheld whiteboard here and draw a picture. I think that many of us that have had high school science have been exposed to what's called the exponential decay along the x-axis and the y-axis. I think many of us have seen this type of graph. Well, if the x-axis here is time running, and let's say from 1750 to 2020, and then y is the strengths of the Earth's magnetic field, and I'll just put MF there. So if you've got the strength of the Earth's magnetic field on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, we actually have measurements of the strength of the magnetic field in Paris and Germany going back to 1750 and certainly coming up to today. So the modern magnetic field is decaying in strength. Well, what does that allow us to do? Well, it turns out it allows us to do a process called extrapolation. We can go back on this graph to the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, say 10,000 years ago, and compare it with what we find in the Maxwell equations and other parts of the electrical engineering side of life. Now, George probably remembers this, but maybe some of you have forgotten it. If you use your right hand, there's what's called a right hand rule.
Yes.
That if there is the flow of electricity in the direction of my fingers, then my thumb is going to point in the direction of the generation of a magnetic field.
Yes.
So if we use the ubiquitous Play-Doh around my kindergarten teacher retired house here, if you use the Play-Doh as the earth, and then you place a pin in the center of it like this, there is a flow of electricity in the mantle and outer core that goes this way around the equator and produces a magnetic field north-south pole. The fact that this magnetic field could not be maintained for millions or billions of years is a remarkable young Earth argument. Certainly not the only one, but it's one that can be explained in 5 minutes. So that's that. What's the next question? Zinc deposits in Tennessee. His thoughts on the geology of northwest Tennessee. Well, the zinc deposits are actually in northeast Tennessee. We have discussed with Standing for Truth making one of my sessions in January the origin of these zinc deposits in the limestones of East Tennessee. So we'll defer that till January.
David, it's interesting that you show that exponential decay curve.
Yes.
But are you aware that if you take the ages or the life expectancies of the main characters in the Bible from the flood
Yes.
to modern, that also shows an exponential decay curve where
Right.
the R squared value is 0.9. Now, for those that don't know much about statistical analyses, an R squared value of 1 is a perfect fit, and you would never expect that because you'd question maybe fraudulent activity there. But 0.9 is considered a very good fit, and it's amazing. Dr. Sanford actually uses that example in his genetic entropy. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah,
this is if you fit a line, not to the magnetic field, but to a change of state after the flood, the drop of people living over 600 years down to people living about 100 fits just what you would expect statistically.
Now, David, Dr. James Carter's got a good question for you.
Yeah. Good to meet you, sir. And your question is a good one. Has anyone looked at satellite topography to identify bowl-like land depressions that may have trapped deceased animals as the floodwaters receded? Dr. Carter, this is an excellent question to ask. I'm going to switch gears a bit and answer it 2 ways. To my knowledge, no one has actually looked at this satellite topography that's available. But it's an excellent idea. And it reminds me of something that Dr. Henry Morris told us repeatedly in the mid-'80s. When someone like James Carter asks a question you don't know, you say, listen, I work for the Institute for Creation Research, not the Institute for Creation Answers. So I don't know anybody that's doing that, but it's an excellent idea. But let me tell you why I would have an interest in that. I think we have an adequate explanation for the pre-flood population of trilobites and of T-Rex and of sauropods. But we do not have yet an excellent explanation for the absence of human fossils in what we might, exactly. This might turn up some antediluvian human fossils in the Middle East or undiscovered fossil graveyard. It's a very good point. Dr. Henry Morris, in this book, as a matter of fact, this New Defender Study Bible, in one of the appendices, estimates that there might have been 1 billion people alive at the time of the beginning of the flood. Methuselah would have been the 9th person on board the ark at age 969, but apparently the flood occurred the year of his death. So other researchers, like the guy who writes under the pseudonym John Wood Morripy, his actual name is Jan Petchkus, his estimate is 100 million. Well, whether it's 1 billion or 100 million, you would think that we would find more human fossils than we do. And the argument that's been used over the years that I've used when I have been asked this question is twofold. There is a whole scientific study about the way creatures die. My memory is it's called taphonomy, maybe. But at any rate, it's a study of what happens to a seashell when it dies, what happens to a dog that's run over in the street, and what happens to humans when they drown. Well, it turns out that because of the design of our neck and God's mercy in trying to keep us from drowning, there are some shutdown mechanisms that causes, if you're in the middle of drowning, causes some air to be trapped in your lungs. So someone suggested that hundreds of thousands of humans that were killed floated in the flood of Noah's day and were eaten by the creatures that were they were eaten by the creatures that were not on board the ark. There were no aquaria on board the ark. So there was not an aquarium for the sharks and an aquarium for the seagoing creatures like plesiosaurs and so forth. And so since sharks obviously lived through the flood, and since piranha obviously lived through the flood, what did they eat? Well, some suggest that they ate the humans. A second suggestion that I think can be explored is that if, and I have to think of the geography here, if the east coast of Africa formed one of the boundaries of the pre-flood, you're welcome, Dr. Carter, pre-flood world, and if the west coast of North America formed one of those boundaries, then it could be that as the floodwaters hit and flowed to the edges of the continents, that hundreds of thousands of people were buried 50,000 feet deep in deep marginal basins, which we've explored only to the level of maybe 10,000 feet. I don't know the deepest hole. I have to look that up. And then keep in mind, George, the evolutionary bias. You have a drill stem that ranges from being 6 inches in the diameter, 2 inches in diameter, at most 18 inches in diameter. But by the time you get down to depth, the broken rocks that are being, drilled, and then coming up in the drilling fluid are pieces. And the paleontologists that are looking at these, nowadays it's done photographically, and then the samples are sent back to Dallas or someplace. These guys have been taught evolution for so long, they wouldn't know a human bone from a broken dinosaur bone at depth. So it could be a lot of the data is simply missed because of evolutionary bias.
Well, David, I'm going to take you in a slightly different direction now. I know personally when I was at school, our lecturers encouraged us to do critical thinking.
Yeah.
And when we were taught to calculate, for example, the various forces in structural members,
Yes.
we did. We've got formulas we can use, but we were taught how to do that via first principles.
Yes.
Now, I'll take it to an example where her name is Dr. Nancy Bryson. She actually raised some questions about evolution during her presentation at school, at a school's honours forum. The actual title of that paper was called "Critical Thinking on Evolution."
Yes.
Now, if they're suppressing all these other explanations, they're literally indoctrinating people, and they're not allowed to do that critical thought process, which I think is very important in development of a person's, not only his character, but his brain development.
Oh, I very much agree with you that if you're taught as the Nazis did in the 30s and as the Soviets did, and I guess I'll pick the 50s, if you're in an environment where you're taught that religion is the opiate of the people, or in Hitler's case, that the economic problems of the Weimar Republic were because of Jewish businessmen. And by the way, they're obviously not as evolved as Aryans. When you're taught that sort of thing, you become indoctrinated. You don't become intellectual giants.
Yes, you're taught not to question things, and that's the worst thing you could do.
Yes, I very much agree with that. And the problems that we've highlighted today of academic discrimination, Darwin doubters, people that have the audacity to believe that Behe is right, that DNA is like a mousetrap. It's irreducibly complex. It drives me mad. It makes my Scottish blood boil to see the evolutionist claim, oh, it wasn't a watchmaker. Paley wasn't right. If you find a watch on the beach, that doesn't mean there's a watchmaker. It could be a blind watchmaker. And then they'll take a mousetrap and they'll attach it to their tie as a tie clasp. And they'll say, Here, you see, I used a mousetrap for some purpose other than catching mice. So that kind of argument is not conducive to the proper Christmas spirit.
There are so many other things we could talk about, but I think we're going on to 1 hour and 40 minutes at the moment. So unless you got something else to bring up, David, maybe you could introduce the audience to some of our next talks, some of the ones that are coming up.
I'll do this. Standing for Truth, George and a variety of other people have liked this group of topics. I've done quite a study about the origin of zinc deposits in East Tennessee, where I did my undergraduate work. And then at Michigan, I was introduced to the really phenomenal native copper deposits in northern Michigan the part of Michigan that's separated by water that's called the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I'd like to talk about that as evidences of not only events during the creation week, but events during the flood, with the copper being an example of creation week and the zinc being an example of a flood year deposit, but also as an example of God's grace. So those two topics fascinate me. Since my boyhood, I've been fascinated by the Apollo missions. So I've followed the mineralogy and geology of the rocks that have been brought back from the moon. And it turns out that if you look at the chemistry of the lunar rocks, another way to put it is if you look at the detailed titanium mineralogy of the minerals in those rocks that were brought back by Apollo, it turns out the moon is much richer in titanium and other elements than would be predicted by any of the theories of lunar origin. And so I called the chemistry of the moon one of God's fingerprints showing the truth of Genesis, that we have the lesser light to rule the night and the greater light to rule the day, using the King James vocabulary. And so God has put his fingerprint on the moon as being created, not evolved. So there are some upcoming topics that we have to discuss.
I look forward to those. They sound very interesting.
Once again, Standing for Truth, thank you so much for this time. And well, let me comment about Dr. Carter's latest one there.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you think we'd find fossilization of animals buried in Spirit Lake following the Mount St. Helens eruption? Well, I'm sure there were some animals that were in those trees before the explosion. The volcanic event was between 1,000 and 2,000 degrees in eruption. A lot of that would have been melted. Dr. Steve Austin has studied Mount St. Helens for the last 40 years. And in the mid 1980s, when I was part of ICR, he learned to scuba so he could go with the team and actually scuba underneath the floating mat of logs. So I'm sure we would find fossilization of plants in Spirit Lake, but I don't know about animals. I hope that in the future, Dr. Steve Austin and some other creationists like Ed Hollerud and others will join us in a 5 individual roundtable discussion.
Yeah, David, Pompeii in Italy, that was an example of a volcano eruption, and I think an entire village or town was actually buried in that ash, and many of the occupants in those buildings were literally stoned, if you like. They were literally stoned in the same position as probably when they died. So I believe there were some individuals at the Mount St. Helens that were also in their own cabins that refused to move.
Yes.
So if they ever excavate those and find them, they'll probably find the same thing.
Perhaps so. Interesting example of archaeology, Pompeii.
Yeah.
Standing for Truth, I'm going to find the exit button here on my screen. And once again, I want to thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and don't mind the background. I've got the little ones who woke up from a nap. So yeah, no, I want to say thanks again, Professor Mcqueen. This 2 hours flew by, and I want to point out to the audience too, who are loving this. If you have not yet seen Professor Mcqueen's previous lectures and discussions here, please go check out the playlist that I've made. So great questions to the audience. once again, another one to remember Professor Mcqueen. We just got a super sticker that came in. Brother Mitchell, thank you so much. We appreciate the support. And Professor Mcqueen, we are excited for that roundtable discussion. So
we will work on that. That probably will be deferred to February, but we'll continue working on it.
Okay,
gentlemen,
awesome.
And
God
ladies
bless.
and gentlemen of the audience, bye-bye and Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas, David.
Merry Christmas.
God bless.
God bless.
It's Christmas.